His name is Larry Zabel, an artist in search of a vision. For years now, he has tried to reflect on his canvases the fundamental reality of the American West. Although he is one of America's foremost Western artists, if you ask him about his task, he will probably say he has failed. He hasn't found what he's been searching for. So, he's come to the Bitterroot country once again, looking for the heart of the land. There was a time when Gary Cooper came this way, and naturalist John Muir. Chief Joseph dragged his sorrows over that mountain to the north. Theodore Roosevelt had a ranch just up the way. Along this road, Zane Grey pursued his muscular stories. Little Joe and Hoss journeyed from here into our living rooms. Each has shaped our perception of this beautiful, elusive land. Each has helped to create a mythology that masks what the land has meant and can mean in our lives. Larry Zabel.
I think if you sift it all out, there are two basic views of the West. One is reflected in the works of the great landscape artists like Thomas Moran and Albert Bierstadt. They focused on the land itself, the beauty, the vast open spaces, and the aesthetic qualities of the land. Then there were the cowboy artists like Charlie Russell. They were more fascinated by what was happening on the land.
Today, these two views of the American West have come into conflict, especially as they relate to livestock grazing on public lands. If art really does mirror life, the issue of public land grazing should be clear and decisive. For those who choose to see the West through Bierstadt, livestock have no place on public lands. And for those who see the West through Russell, there are few problems on public land and too many restrictions. The problem is, both beliefs are based on historical interpretations of the West that have been swept away by the passing of time. Although few actually see themselves as identifying with either extreme, the images are dangerously convenient when trying to categorize someone else's point of view. The fact is, the untouched or untamed West has developed into a mosaic of private and public lands inhabited both by domestic livestock and free-ranging wildlife. For years, through lease agreements in Montana and the other 10 western states, stockmen have been permitted to graze their livestock on state and federal lands, places that are important to a great diversity of wildlife. Elk, deer, antelope, moose, mountain sheep, badger, coyote, and fox, as well as upland game birds, waterfowl, even grizzly bears, use these lands. lands that have been and are becoming increasingly important for hunting, fishing, and other recreation uses by the public. Places which provide the freedom that is such a part of the face of the American West. Many of the elk sought by wildlife enthusiasts spend part of the year on private lands in Montana. Lands that are very important to livestock producers. Places reserved for winter pasture or for the production of forage, which is harvested, stored, and fed to their livestock throughout the critical winter months. With such diverse interests and demands, the true image of today's West is understandably difficult to capture. But one thing is for sure: the health of the land is the common foundation for the many lifestyles and livelihoods that exist in today's West. While not opposed to grazing, some conservation groups point to poor grazing practices that have damaged rangeland, vegetation, and wildlife habitat, and along streams cause erosion, degrade water quality, and diminish fisheries. Montana Wildlife Federation spokesman Jim Richard.
The crux of the grazing issue takes place right here on the land, when the vegetation, soils, water, fish and wildlife, when these resources are healthy, everyone really benefits. It is possible with proper management to graze livestock and to maintain the health and vigor of these resources. At times, however, livestock are not properly managed. When too many cows are grazed for too long a time, plant vigor is diminished, soil erodes, water quality is degraded, and over time we will have a deterioration of the range condition. When poor practices occur on public lands, public resources are degraded, and citizens understandably get extremely upset. This important riparian vegetation is oftentimes the first to suffer from poor livestock management. Livestock prefer these cool, shady areas, and as a result, overuse tends to occur. The result is trampled stream banks, soil erosion, degraded water quality, and a loss of important forage and habitat for fish and wildlife.
Many, including ranchers, point to studies that indicate grazing can be compatible with the goals of wildlife management, and that western range plants evolved in response to drought and grazing. Rancher Chase Hibbert.
We're doing some things on the ranch that I'm very proud of in terms of managing the basic resource. Many people look at selling the livestock off the ranch as what you really do. I don't look at my role there as being a livestock salesman. Really what our product is the grass on the land. It's the long-term sustainability of the land which is going to produce that grass, which is going to reward us eventually in pounds of beef, in pounds of lamb that we can sell, and jobs that we can provide to the community. I tend to think of wildlife as elk, since in our particular area that's what we deal with the most. Rather than seeing the elk and the game in the pastures that are the rest fields, we are seeing them follow the cattle. The reason for that, I think, is that the cattle take all that old woody decadent grass away, and the new grasses that come in are shorter, are tenderer, are more succulent. So they're actually drawing the elk to the grazed areas. There were things that were done years and years ago. The entire West was overgrazed in the 1880s. We are living with consequences of that today. It is my goal and my objective to do things for the land, for the grass, through management, to make it better. But this thing is bigger than life. It goes back in time. Hopefully it's going to go forward in time to the next generation.
Chase Hibbert runs a large cattle and sheep ranching operation in Montana. He could survive without his federal grazing permits. But for some ranches, public land is critical to their operation. Without access to and careful stewardship of the forage on public lands, some ranches that have been in operation for 3 or 4 generations would be out of business. No longer could they feed their animals year-round. During the homestead era, failed ranches were oftentimes abandoned, forgotten, left to nature. Aside from the lives of the people directly involved in the failed ranch, little changed. But today, market value of western ranch land often dictates a new use for the landscape. More and more people want to own the western experience, a slice of the Montana dream. However, the dream of open space, rural sense of community, and the western lifestyle are largely made possible by working ranches. When large ranches, with their open landscape and critical wildlife habitat, are eliminated, everything changes. Land stewardship becomes a moot point. There is a need most of us have to see the American West through the eyes of Albert Bierstadt and Thomas Moran. We wish the West to be what it was on the morning of the 8th day of creation. We would have our pristine forests and great expanses of grass, and the mountains rising pure as John Muir's dream from the earth. In the meadows and the high country would be elk and eagle and bear. There would be wilderness and solitude as deep as a holy mind. There is also in most of us a need to see the world of the American West through the eyes of Charlie Russell, to feel the energy and promise and simplicity of a life lived close to the earth. His world was filled with passion and struggle and possibility. The land was essential to his art, but it was the human struggle and triumph that energized his canvases. Again, Larry Zabel.
Trouble is, we're never going to find either one of those worlds. They're both gone. The pristine west of Bierstadt and Muir, the gold rush ended all that. The settlement of the West swallowed up much of the wilderness. And the traditional family ranch of Charlie Russell has been swallowed up just the same. If not by hard economic times, by urbanization and economic opportunities. People are buying up the Ponderosa dream. I'm not saying I like it, I don't. I'm just saying it's real, so I've got to decide. Am I going to paint the myth or what's real? And there's no reason in my mind that what's real can't be just as beautiful as the myth.
From the very beginning of the conservation movement, grazing on public lands has been an issue. Gifford Pinchot, who headed the early years of the Forest Service, wrote that grazing was the toughest and most controversial issue he confronted. When the forest reserves were first established, grazing was specifically prohibited. And then, limited grazing was permitted on a few ranges. In July of 1905, Pinchot issued 7,981 grazing permits, an action that would infuriate his friend, naturalist John Muir, and cause a rift between conservationists that would last for nearly a century. Grazing on public lands is nothing new. Whether the practice is right or wrong, just or unjust, destructive or enhancing, livestock grazing has been with us since long before Muir and Pinchot ended their friendship over the issue a century ago. How then can there be any common ground between the vision of Charlie Russell and the dream of Thomas Moran? Larry Zabel.
When I begin thinking about a painting, I always start with the land. Everything begins with the land. Then I began to think about what might have happened on the land. I think one of the things about the grazing issue is that both sides agree on the most important thing. They share a love of the land. The rancher, if he's a good one and is successful, loves the land just as much as the most ardent preservationist. If his land is not healthy, his operation will fail. If he isn't a good steward of the land, what he passes on to his children will have little value.
For the first time in 100 years, it appears Bierstadt and Russell are finding common ground. It is a common ground largely based on concern for the land. This is the Fleecer Wildlife Management Area in southwestern Montana. 6,000 acres of prime elk winter range purchased by the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks in 1962. Wildlife biologist Mike Frazina.
The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks purchased Fleecer Wildlife Management Area to provide critical winter habitat for elk. All domestic livestock were removed, and for the first 20 years, the area was managed exclusively for the production of wildlife. And by the early 1980s, we had reached an elk population size to where they were using the entire landscape.
Adjacent to the Fleecer Mountain Wildlife Management Area is the Smith 6-Bar S Ranch. For years, Maynard Smith had grazed his pastures using a rest rotation system. Maynard Smith.
Yeah, we've been in a rest rotation system for about the last 30 years on this ranch. And rest rotation is simply a simple three-pasture system that you save one pasture, don't use it at all in the year. The other pasture you use early in the spring, and the third pasture you use late in the year. And this way you have two growing seasons for your forage to replenish itself, replenish its root system. Well, what we found was that the elk on the game range, which is adjacent to our land, were coming over, going over the fence or through it onto our fields that had been used. And especially in the springtime, the field that had been used early the year before, as well as the others too, because the feed was a lot more nutritious and palatable to them. Sometimes 700-800 head, and on the other side of the fence was a game range that had no use for the past 20 years or so. There was no livestock use on that game range, and the elk used it, and then as the years went on, I think they used it probably less and less because the feed just became rank and very decadent. I think every rancher loves to see wildlife. It resembles something wild and free, but when you see big bunches of them eating into your pocketbook, it kind of hurts a little bit. You know that the elk are going to go where they want to go. I mean, they just go over a fence or through a fence, and they're free roaming, whereas cattle, you can keep them confined and use the pastures the way that you'd want to.
As a wildlife biologist, Frazina agonized over the implications. Instead of keeping wildlife and livestock apart, as had been the practice for years, it seemed the logical solution was to put some cattle back on the game range under careful management. Adjacent to the north of Smith's land was a large portion of public land managed by the Forest Service. Frazina, Smith, and Forrest Morin, a representative of the Forest Service, decided to ignore ownership boundaries at Fleecer.
We took the lands that are important to elk, and we designed one management system that incorporates all those land ownerships over the elk range.
And in order to do that, we wound up devising a 12-pasture grazing system. And under that grazing system, each year 5 pastures are rested. The remainder are grazed, some of them intensively for short time periods, while others are deferred and rested to provide for the wildlife and the vegetation. And by developing this program, then, we were able to increase the wintering elk population on Fleecer by several hundred head more.
And I think that my own observation is that the elk in the wintertime are using the game range a lot more than they did previously. You see them all over it and far down into the area where there's no security for them. We see that when we go on in the spring with our cattle. We can see where the elk have been. They've been all over that game range now. And before, they really didn't have that type of use.
By 1990, it became clear the grasses for both elk and livestock had increased on Fleecer, and some wildlife people began to be a little more positive about carefully managed livestock grazing in wildlife areas. Following the success at Fleecer, several more coordinated public-private management programs were initiated. Again, results suggested that with careful management, grazing cattle actually improved the vigor and palatability of the range plants. A program coordinating grazing of national forest and BLM lands, private range, and Montana's Wall Creek Wildlife Management Area was initiated. The objective was to reduce elk-cattle competition on privately and publicly owned critical elk winter range and to maintain fertile soils and healthy grasslands. In the past, the focus had been on the animal. Ranchers have managed for livestock. Biologists have managed for wildlife. It is clear the focus must change. Now, management is for the land itself.
The key to successful land management is management of the habitat, and our first goal is to manage the soils and the vegetation properly, whether wildlife or livestock is the primary objective. And if you have a management approach in place that takes care of the soils and the vegetation so that those essential ingredients can thrive and prosper, most of these conflicts are resolved quite readily by the habitat itself and the problems go away.
But the conflict hasn't just gone away. Although Fleecer and Wall Creek show that in well-designed and controlled management systems, grazing need not degrade public lands, problems still exist. Not all ranchers are willing to be involved in a public grazing system that demands such careful management. Some people refuse to accept that cows have any place on public lands. Again, rancher Chase Hibbert.
Times are changing, demographics are changing. People are getting further away from their agricultural roots. There's been a population shift from rural to urban. Cities are more powerful. Other industries are becoming more significant. Tourism is growing rapidly, for instance, in Montana. Things have changed a great deal. We're used to in agriculture having our own way for years and years. That is no longer possible. We're gonna begin to have to compromise in some areas, and I think maybe more importantly, we never questioned in the past whether we were right or not. We were powerful enough and significant enough in the grand scheme of things that we always thought we were right. Now, I think we need to justify our position more and more, and we have to spend much more of our time educating the public about what it is we're doing and why it is we're doing it.
And again, Montana Wildlife Federation spokesman Jim Richard.
I think the ranching community and public land managers need to understand that the public wants to enjoy the resources on public lands, and that the ranching community and the land managers must be committed to livestock management practices that will protect those resources. I think we conservationists need to be honest in how we characterize the issues and try to avoid exaggerating resource problems. We need to be willing to work cooperatively and patiently in solving some of these issues.
The larger issue seems clear. Livestock grazing on public lands may be in the rancher's best interest, and when the needs of the land are considered first, it can be in the public's best interest as well. While there are still serious differences, there is more and more common ground, and the common ground is love of the land, love of the lifestyle the land makes possible. And so Larry Zabel works upon his canvas. He has heard the voices of the West, has seen the changes that have swept across the land. He has felt the passions that have bound the people of the land together and that have divided them so severely. At last, the image begins to form, and we wonder what this new vision will be. Will it be Bierstadt or Charlie Russell? Could it be possible that this new vision of the West will weave harmonic patterns from elements of both? For all our differences, for all the differences between Bierstadt and Russell, we all share the same fundamental values: a love of the land and a concern for the life forms upon the land. This shared respect is surely a very powerful beginning. In the words of Montana Governor Mark Roscoe, let us each vow quietly in our hearts to shun the tired old games and the worn-out labels. Let us stress, too, in our hearts and our words, not the small differences that might divide us at times. Instead, let us treasure the immense similarities that unite us.